In the heart of Ziana, a village that thrived through the shadow of towering mountains and meandering rivers, an ancient curse lingered, one that people dared not to speak of too loudly. For generations, women bore the full blown of pregnancy, their bellies swelling with life, only to meet silence when the time came to deliver. There were no cries of newborns, no joyous wails of new mothers cradling their infants. Instead, the women of Ziana carried their children for 9 long months, but no life was ever born. It had begun many seasons ago, but with each passing year, the village fell deeper in despair. Whispers of curses spread like wildfire across the fields and forests. The men of Ziana, once proud warriors and hunters, now feared the very air they breathed, as if some unseen force was choking the life out of their futures. The silence that blackened the village weighed heavier than the mountains themselves. Chief Mukoma, a man of strength and honor, led Ziana with a firm but passionate hand. His broad shoulders carried not only the responsibilities of leadership, but also the unbearable grief of a childless future. His wife, Nalia, had carried a pregnancy to full term, but when the time came, she too experienced the cold, bitter silence that haunted so many women. Mukoma's heart hardened by battle, softened in the face of such personal pain, driving him to seek answers far beyond the borders of Ziana. The village elders, whose skin was like wrinkled parchment, spoke of ancient agreement with the gods. It was said that the people of Ziana had long been protected by Nana, the river goddess, who blessed the land with fertility and abundance. Every year, the women gathered by the river to offer the finest grains and pour the purest water in the sacred stream. In return, Nana watched over their children, their crops, and their animals. But now, even the goddess seemed to have abandoned them. The river, once flowing and lively, had slowed to a trickle, and the land had begun to wither. Many believed that the curse was a punishment, a divine retribution for sins long forgotten. The elders insisted that the people had displeased Nana, but they could not agree on how. The village elders, healers, tried everything: herbs, prayers, and rituals, but nothing could bring forth the new life the village so desperately needed. Some of the elders spoke of forgotten customs, others of long-lost ceremonies that needed to be revived, but none could pinpoint the exact cause of their suffering, leaving Mukoma feeling helpless in his search for answers. Desperate to save his people, Chief Mukoma sent words to neighboring villages and distant lands, asking for their most powerful healers and spiritual leaders to come and lend their wisdom. They arrived one by one, each with their own methods and promises of salvation, but each left shaking their heads in defeat, unable to lift the curse that had befallen Ziana. In the village square, anxiety grew like a thick fog. Villagers muttered behind closed doors, their whispers fueled by fear and suspicion. Soon, rumors of betrayal began to spread. Some believed the curse was not a punishment from the gods, but rather the result of a deep betrayal from within the village itself. Fingers were pointed and trust began to erode. In the middle of it all stood Adia, the village seer. Her hair long and silver, shimmered like moonlight, and her eyes clouded with age. so deeper than most. Adia had been the spiritual guide for Ziana for as long as anyone could remember. Her visions were trusted, her counsel respected, but in recent months she had grown quiet, retreating to the shadows, as if waiting for something, some revelation that only she could see. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains and painted the sky a deep blood red, Adia called for a gathering. The entire village crowded into the square, their faces lit by the flickering glow of torchlight. Chief Mukoma stood at the center, his wife, Nalia, at his side. The air was thick with tension as Adia slowly made her way to the front. "There is a truth," Adia began, her voice raspy but steady, "that has been hidden from us for too long. The curse we suffer is not the work of the gods alone. There is a darkness among us, a betrayal that runs deeper than the river itself." Gasp rippled through the crowd. Adia raised her hand for silence, her eyes scanning the faces of the villagers. "Someone here has broken the ancient pact with Nana, the river goddess. They have sought power from forbidden places, and in doing so, they have brought this curse upon us all." Chief Mukoma's heart raced in his chest. He had heard the whispers of betrayal, but to hear Adia confirm it chilled him to the bone. His gaze flickered to Nalia. She had become distant in recent months, spending more time by the river than ever before, often alone. Was it possible that she did that? Before Mukoma could dwell on the thought, Adia spoke again. "This betrayal has not been committed by one person. There is another, a woman who walks among us, trusted by all, yet she has sought power beyond her station." The villagers turned to one another, suspicion thick in the air. Who among them could have dared to defy the goddess? Adia's eyes, milky and distant, locked onto one figure in the crowd. Juma, the chief's most trusted advisor and lifelong friend, stood frozen as Adia's figure pointed directly at her. Juma's face drained of color. No, this is a mistake," she cried, stepping back as the crowd turned towards her. "I have served this village with honor and loyalty. I would never betray our customs." But Adia shook her head, her voice now trembling with the weight of the truth she carried. "You sought forbidden knowledge, Juma. You delved in dark forces, ancient powers that were never meant for us to touch. In doing so, you broke the sacred bond with Nana, and it is your actions that have brought this curse upon us." The crowd erupted into chaos. Some cried out in anger, with others wept in fear. Juma, her eyes wild with disbelief, turned to Chief Mukoma. "You know me, Mukoma. We grew up together. I would never do that." But Mukoma stood silent, his heart torn into two. He had trusted Juma with his life, but now the weight of her betrayal hung heavy in the air. His gaze shifted to Nalia, who stood at his side, her face pale and expressionless. Adia, sensing the growing tension, raised her voice once more. "There is more," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nalia." At the mention of his wife's name, Mukoma's heart stopped. He turned to her, his eyes searching her for any sign of guilt or betrayal. But Nalia's face remained unreadable. her eyes fixed on the ground. Nalia has also played a part in this, Adia continued, her voice heavy with sorrow. She too sought power from the dark gods. Together, she and Juma broke the sacred pact, and together they must face the consequences. The silence that followed was deafening. The villagers stood in stunned disbelief, unable to comprehend the enormity of what they had just heard. Mukoma, his heart shattered, turned into Nalia. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nalia's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Her silence was all the confirmation Mukoma needed. The crowd, now fueled by fear and anger, began to murmur once more. Cries for justice, for retribution, filled the air. Mukoma, his mind racing, struggled to process the betrayal of both his wife and his closest friend. He had loved Nalia deeply, and his trust in Juma had been unshakable. But now, everything he had known, everything he had believed in, was coming before him. Adia stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "There is only one way to break the curse," she said, her eyes fixed on Mukoma. "A sacrifice must be made." Mukoma's heart sank. He knew what Adia meant. The betrayal had to be paid for with blood, and only then could the village be freed from the curse that had taken hold of it. But Mukoma hesitated. He looked at Juma, her eyes filled with fear and desperation, and then at Nalia, who stood silent, her face streaked with tears. These were the two people he had trusted more than anyone in the world, but now he was being asked to sacrifice them both. The crowd, sensing Mukoma's hesitant, grew restless. Cries for justice grew louder, and Mukoma knew he had no choice. He turned to Adia, his voice steady but heavy with sorrow. "Tell me, what must be done?" he said. Adia stepped forward, her eyes filled with sorrow. "The river must be appeased," she said. "Only a sacrifice made in its waters can break the curse and restore life to the village." Mukoma nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he had to make. He turned to Juma, his lifelong friend, and then to Nalia, his beloved wife. He knew what had to be done, but the thought of it tore him apart. As he stood there, staring at the two women he loved and trusted most, the weight of their betrayal pressed down on his soul. The villagers were growing more impatient, their murmurs rising into chants of justice. The air was thick with tension, and Mukoma felt trapped between his duty as a leader and his personal grief. Juma's eyes pleaded with him, her lips trembling as she struggled to find words. "Mukoma, we grew up together. You know me. I only wanted to help our people. Yes, I sought knowledge beyond what was allowed, but I never meant for this to happen." Her voice cracked as she spoke, her despair clear. Mukoma clenched his fist. He wanted to believe her. He remembered their childhood, the way they would race through the fields, dreamed of leading the village together, and shared secrets at the river. But now those memories felt tainted, poisoned by the truth of what she had done. Nalia, standing by his side, remained silent. She had yet to speak a single word since Adia's revelation. Her face was a mask of grief, but not denial. Mukoma's heart twisted as he turned to her. "Why, Nalia?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crowd. "Why did you do this?" Her lips parted, but for a moment no sound came out. Then, in a voice so quiet it was nearly lost in the wind, she spoke. "I was desperate." The words cut through Mukoma like a blade. Nalia's eyes filled with tears as she continued, her voice trembling. "I wanted a child, Mukoma. I wanted so badly to give you an heir, to give our village hope. I prayed to Nana, to the gods, but nothing happened. I wanted as more women carried their pregnancy only to be met with silence. I couldn't bear it. When Juma came to me with another way, I thought it would save us all." Mukoma's heart cracked open as her words, a flood of emotions, anger, sorrow, love rushing through him all at once. He understood her pain. It was his pain too. But she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had both been betrayed by each other, by their trust in forces they did not understand. Adia, sensing the internal struggle tearing Mukoma apart, stepped forward. "Chief Mukoma," she said gently, her voice like the wind in the trees. "The time for decisions is upon us. The village is on the brink of collapse. The river demands its justice. The river, the very lifeblood of their village. Its waters had nurtured their crops, fed their livestock, and brought fertility to their people for centuries. Now it stood as both judge and executioner." Mukoma's eyes traveled to the distant riverbanks. There, the water shimmered under the pale light of the moon. It seemed to glow with an otherworldly light, as if waiting for the village to pay the price for his betrayal. He knew that what must be done. Turning to the villagers, he raised his hand for silence. The crowd quieted, their eyes fixed on their leader. Mukoma took a deep breath, the weight of his next words pressing heavily on him. "There will be no justice without a sacrifice," he said, his voice strong despite the tremor in his heart. "Juma, Nalia, both of you have betrayed the village, and for that you must face the river's judgment." Gasps echoed through the crowd. Some cried out in shock, others in agreement, but Mukoma held his gaze steadily, even as he felt his heart shattering. Juma stepped forward, defiance still lingering in her eyes despite the fear. "You are going to let the river take me?" she spat. "After everything I have done for you, for this village, you are a coward, Mukoma." Her words stung, but Mukoma remained resolute. He turned his back on her, looking towards Nalia. She hadn't moved, but her eyes were locked on his, filled with sorrow and regret. She didn't protest. She didn't plead. She simply accepted her fate, as if she knew it had been written long before this moment. Adia stepped forward, her hands raised towards the sky, as she began the ancient chant that would summon the river goddess's presence. The village parted, creating a path towards the water. Mukuma's heart pounded as he led the procession, his feet heavy with every step. The riverbank loomed closer. As they approached, the water began to stir. What had been a calm, glassy surface now rippled and churned as if some great force beneath the river had awakened. The villagers huddled together in fear, watching in silence as a deer chant grew louder, calling forth Nana, the river goddess. Mukoma stood at the edge of the water, Juma and Nalia beside him. Adia turned to the crowd. The river demands a life in exchange for the lives it has taken, she said. Only through sacrifice can the curse be lifted. Juma's chest heaved with panic. No, she cried, backing away. I won't let this happen. I won't be sacrificed for this. Before anyone could stop her, Juma bolted towards the trees, disappearing in the forest. The crowd erupted in confusion, some calling for her to be caught, others to stand to move. But Mukoma stood frozen, watching the river begin to swell. The water rose slowly at first, then faster, lapping at the banks and threatening to spill over. Nana's wrath was palpable in the air. The goddess would not be denied. Nalia stepped forward, her head bowed. I should have been me all along, she whispered. I was the one who begged Juma to help me. I wanted this, even when I knew it was wrong. Mukoma reached out, his hand trembling as it found her, Nalia. She turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. I love you, Mukoma. I always have, but I cannot undo what I have done. Before Mukoma could stop her, Nalia stepped into the river. The water surged around her, pulling her in as if it recognized her sacrifice. Mukoma lunged forward, but Adia held him back. The goddess had claimed her. Adia said softly, her eyes brimming with sorrow. Mukoma collapsed to his knees, watching helplessly as the water enveloped Nalia, her form disappearing beneath the surface. The river rolled with fury for a moment longer before it began to recede, the water calming as the sacrifice was accepted. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the river slowly returned to its normal, tranquil flow. The curse had been lifted, but at what cost? The days that followed were marked by a strange stillness in Ziana. The women who had carried their pregnancies for so long began to deliver healthy babies, the first cries of newborns echoing through the village. Life returned to the field, and the crops once withered began to thrive again, but the joy was tempered by the memory of what had been lost. Juma was never seen again. Some whispered that she had been consumed by the forest, taken by the dark forest forces she had summoned. Others believed she had fled far from Ziana, too ashamed to return, but her name was never spoken aloud. A shadow that lingered over the village like a stain that could not be washed away. Chief Mukoma, once a proud and strong leader, now walked with a heaviness that could not be lifted. He spent his days by the river, staring into its depth, searching for something that could never be found. The loss of Nalia weighed on him, her sacrifice haunting him in every quiet moment. The village, though healed, would never forget the events that transpired. The betrayal of trust, the breaking of sacred customs, and the ultimate sacrifice that left scars that ran deep. And while the river goddess had been appeased, the people of Ziana knew that the balance between their world and the gods was fragile, easily disturbed by those who sought power beyond their reach. As the season changed and years passed, Ziana slowly began to rebuild itself, but the memory that the blood-red moon and the betrayal of Juma and Nalia remained etched in the hearts of the villagers. The river, once a source of life and prosperity, was now a reminder of them, thin line between life and death, between loyalty and betrayal. And as Mukoma sat by the river, watching its waters flow endlessly towards the horizon, He knew that some things could never truly be washed away. The river, like the past, would never forget. With the expanded story, I delved further into character, motivations, emotions, and the consequences of betrayal. The themes of power, trust, and sacrifice are explored deeply, weaving a complex narrative that touches on the personal struggles of character while maintaining the mystical and cultural aspects of village customs. Thank you for watching this story, and in case you have liked the story, please share